All right, everybody, we're gonna go ahead and get going. Before I turn it over to Katrina, all of you guys, and including you all online, probably aware of the stuff going on in NIOSH this week. Just wanted to give a little bit of an update. This is from Kurt. So he's obviously very loose in what's going on with the ERCs and the other centers funded through NIOSH and all that stuff. There is no indication at this point that funding for centers like ours, centers across the country, is going to be cut. No indication of that so far. Obviously, there's uncertainty about what exactly is happening in NIOSH. No news, any word about any cuts to the funding of centers like ours. Kurt feels very good about where things stand, or feels as relates to funding for the center. Beyond that, the center enjoys really robust bipartisan support at Congress and in the state legislature. I mean, I've been on the phone with Kurt multiple times this week. No panic or anything like that. So just wanted to mention that because I know a lot of you guys are thinking about that and seeing the news. If you have any other questions, feel free to ask me, ask Kurt, the other leadership in the center, any of that stuff. I just wanted to address that. And I'll turn it over to Katrina.
All right. Well, thank you for taking the time to be here. This paper is the prevalence of flat foot among young Korean males and the correlation among flat foot angles measured in weight-bearing lateral radiographs. So the purpose of this, is this working? It is not. Second, please. Gotta love technology. Okay. So the purpose of this is to determine the prevalence of mild to severe flat foot in the 19-year-old Korean military recruit population by severity of their flat foot, as well as geographic region by analyzing two common radiographic measures and their correlations as derived from surgeon-reviewed weight-bearing sagittal or side view radiographs. So in the military, flat foot is often considered a recruitment exclusion criterion for service. This is often kind of hand-wavy in countries without conscription, but for those that do have conscription, this is usually officially stated as a potential area of concern. It's specifically used to delineate whether or not somebody will have proper full active service or supplementary service during their conscription period. The rationale for why these individuals is excluded is often left very ambiguous. But as often as it's pretty debated in literature, but the general sentiment is that individuals with flat feet have an elevated risk for fatigue, foot blisters, or metatarsal stress fractures on their feet, usually as the result of impacts from jumping or more likely rucking or marching. So the purpose of this paper was to identify the overall prevalence of flat foot in both symptomatic and asymptomatic presentations, so whether or not they have routine pain while walking, running, and so forth, for South Korean military recruits, as well as looking at correlations between the measures that they commonly use to identify flat foot. So the data that was used in this study was collected from mandatory draft physical examinations. And so when a person is conscripted, they have to fill out some questionnaires that relate to any possible health concerns that they might have. And this specific study was taking place or focusing on data from 2018 to 2020. The population size that they evaluated was 560,141 19-year-old Korean males and this constituting about 97.5% of the 19-year-old Korean male population in South Korea. The remaining 2.5% that were not part of this study were excluded from service, generally on the grounds of having a criminal record or just not being able to properly move. So individuals who self-identified that they had flat foot were given side view radiographs like the ones that you can see right here. And these radiographs were then evaluated by military orthopedic surgeons who measured a couple different metrics. So the first of these is the Meary's angle, which is that one on the top right there. And then the second one is the calcaneal pitch angle, which is the second one on the bottom. And I'll explain those in a little more detail in a second. For statistics, they use the Pearson correlation coefficients to look at these results. So this is the first angle. This is the talo-first metatarsal angle, or the TMA, also known as the Meary's angle. It's a little bit faster to refer to it that way, so I'll just be referring to this as a Meary's angle. And this is defined as the long axis of the talus relative to the long axis of the first metatarsal, which you can see right there. And the second one is the calcaneal pitch angle. The calcaneal pitch angle is based off of the ground all the way up to, and this is from the side view, up to the inferior aspects of the calcaneus, which is that bone highlighted right there. The researchers used these definitions here to define flat foot as well as pes cavus or high arches, using both of these measures at the same time. This is different from the standard that they use currently in South Korea because the one that they're proposing uses both the Meares angle and the calcaneal pitch, whereas the one currently used by the South Korean military, at least as of 2022, will only use either one of these angles at any given time for their final determination on whether or not they have severe or mild flat foot. They also looked at whether or not BMI would be a risk factor for flat foot on the grounds that if somebody has a higher BMI, their arch might be suppressed a little bit. And so height and weight data were also collected and considered and evaluated with one-way ANOVAs. Bonferroni corrections were applied for post hoc analyses for between group and within group comparisons. So of the 560,000 or so males that they looked at, about 20,989 or 3.7% of them self-identified as having flat feet, which corresponded to 16,102 or 76.7% of these individuals actually having flat feet as defined by their definitions. So this is the resulting demographics data. The one that's of most interest is the total one. All the other subcolumns are different regions for within Korea. So the total prevalence of flat foot in any form was 2.9%, with 0.9% of them being like moderate to severe cases, and then mild being the remaining 1.9%. If we focus on individuals who had to get sorted out into supplementary services, specifically because they have flat foot, evidently about 27.6% of individuals in supplementary service were because of their flat-footed condition. So the next thing is their evaluation of the comparison between the TMA or the Meares angle and then their calcaneal pitch angle. And that's because, as I previously noted, the military utilizes definitions that either define flat foot off of one of these values or the other. So they're trying to see whether or not that using one of those angles is a pretty good indicator of issues at another portion of the foot. So these are the Pearson correlation coefficients obtained for both of the feet. And this is a little bit hard to look at. So this is what all the angles look like. So the gist of it is that ultimately, all the values that you see here have p-values of less than 0.001. So they are statistically significant. But the relationships that you see here vary in terms of their relative strength. So if you're looking at the left foot versus the right foot or the right foot versus the left foot for either the Meares angle or the calcaneal pitch, there's a pretty strong correlation between the two. Feet aren't going to be perfectly matched to one another. If you're one of those lucky people who have one foot that's like a half size larger than the other, you're probably very aware of this. But when it comes to actually looking at the angles, like comparing Meares angles versus calcaneal pitch angles, the correlation is there, but it's only about 0.34 at the lower end and 0.49. So it's not the best. It's extant, but I wouldn't place anything on it. The results when comparing BMI values versus flat foot actually showed that anybody who had a non-standard presentation of like foot, so any type of foot deformity as defined here, so either high arches or flat feet of any type, were more likely to have a higher BMI compared to individuals who had pes rectus or normal feet. And this was true for both the Meares angle as well as the calcaneal pitch angles. So ultimately, the authors concluded that South Korea has lower reported flat foot values compared to other countries. They specifically compared against values from studies done in Saudi Arabia, which reported a 5% prevalence among their recruits, and then Israel, which reported 3.8% like severe cases of flat foot, and then 12.4% of mild instances. They claim that their results are most likely due to the fact that they were the only group that was using a gold standard measure with actual radiographs. In the case of the other two studies, right there, Saudi Arabia uses a plantar footprint test. So you just go on a mat and they look at the general shape of your arches from the mat and then make judgments on whether or not you have flat foot or not. Whereas the one from Israel was actual physician examination, which is more in line with what groups will do. So to put it a little colloquially, there's a lot of going off of vibes when it comes to identifying flat foot. So these people were a little more rigorous in how they tried to identify it. As for the evaluation of BMI results and atypical foot presentations, There's the assumption that people were more likely to have higher BMIs with atypical feet, probably because if you're in a little more pain, then you're probably not as likely to be more active, and that might have a correlation between those two things. So they also concluded by noting that the radiographic measure correlations are extant, just a little bit weak, and they recommend looking at other radiographic measures along other bones to see if there are other relationships that may be more worthwhile to examine. They also noted that using 2D radiographs makes flat-foot identification challenging. You saw those images. You're honestly, to some extent, trying to guess where certain bones are when you're evaluating them. And even if you do have additional information, a lot of the standards put forth in literature are based on pediatric populations with flat feet or symptomatic presentations. They also noted that this paper is at least helping to expand the knowledge base known about adult flat feet, or at least its prevalence. And they also highlighted that the definition that they're using is based on a 1999 paper for individuals with flat feet. But these were individuals whose flat feet were so bad they had to get surgical interventions involving screws, like 4 of them in their feet. So there is some debate on whether or not this is a valid way to consider anatomy. And they also straight up say that the identification of disqualifying flat foot is purposefully left open-ended. In their discussion of how they're defining these things, they say, oh yeah, this is how we defined all of these, but also if the military feels like they need more troops, they will just adjust it. So it's not exactly a done deal. So as far as the strengths and weaknesses of this paper goes, one of the strengths is that this is a pretty large sample size. I haven't seen too many studies that had 97.5% of any portion of their population, so that's pretty nice. They also focused on well-established radiographic measures. They weren't trying to do anything out of the box. They did things that people have previously agreed upon as at least being a reliable way to obtain certain measures. These values were also being derived by orthopedic surgeons as opposed to automated approaches, so they were double-checked for any sort of errors. And then they also did these evaluations off of quantitative measures, unlike the prior studies that were done that used the footprint test or just a physician looking at your feet and going, yeah, that seems fine. As far as weaknesses go, they do use self-identified flat foot cases. To some extent, I can see why this is a thing, considering they would otherwise have to do x-rays on 500,000 people, which logistically doesn't sound like a very good time. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. There were also some concerns about inter-assessor reliability. When the values were being checked, they were always done by regional regional centers for military medicine, meaning that, let's say you're in a rural area, it's just one of you versus you're in Seoul or something, and there's 5 other people who can help you out. There might be some differences in the actual results there. There's also no discussion of the geographic prevalence implications. They put out the table, they say this area has the highest amount, this one has the lowest amount, but they don't actually discuss the implications of that in any particular amount of detail. They also do not delineate between symptomatic and asymptomatic presentations of flat feet, which is a pretty big deal. It doesn't sound like they actually account for whether or not somebody is in pain when they did this. So it seems like you're kind of out of luck, at least according to the benchmark that they're currently using. There's also no discussion of female recruits. To be fair, Korea only has, at least right now, recruitment or conscription of males, but that would still be interesting to evaluate. And then also, they did not use the 3D radiographic measures that are now available to try to gain some better understanding of more accessible angles that might be able to better help trends. And then lastly, they did not provide any discussion of any sort of lifestyle habits, especially exercise, and whether or not that would have any role in somebody's, I guess, manifestation of flat foot. So as far as questions go, they mentioned in the paper that the Asian population in the United States has different prevalence values for flat foot relative to the populations in South Korea. Why might that be the case, and how generalizable are these results? Then should the flat foot examination be self-identified, or should there be some baseline examination that needs to happen, and if there are concerns, push it forward? And can this assumption of trust be applied in other regions, or do you think there might be something more to that? And then, why is it that elevated BMI was observed for both flat foot and high arches? I briefly discussed it, but I'd be curious to hear some other ideas. And also, why collect and analyze geographic data per region without providing a discussion? Okay. Let's start with I mostly want to focus on the second question. Should Flatfoot be self-identified? There's a specific line that acknowledges, there's a lot of, I'm sure all of you have heard of stories of draft dodgers and how Flatfoot is a common one. So any thoughts on this?
So when they join the military, do they not have to go through a physical?
This is part of the physical.
Okay, yeah, because I assume if they're doing that, they can look at their feet.
Yeah, that's kind of the interesting part. They don't seem to look at the feet unless they specifically tick the box on the questionnaire that says they're afraid of having flat feet or any type of foot deformity.
On these more, let's call them the vibes-based methods of evaluating this. Do you think that those methods kind of have a like higher false positive or false negative sort of rate? Because it seems like this is one of those instances where practically it would be like, all right, we're going to do kind of the least cost thing and only elevate you as, you know, check off. But if the false, I guess it'd be the false negative rate is really high on those kind of vibes-based methods, that wouldn't work great.
Yeah, I would say for both of these types of metrics, it can kind of go both ways. I have seen a lot of people who look like they have regular feet until I have them stand barefoot on something, and then their arch just collapses. And then, so that would show up on the footprint test, for example. But then it's like, okay, but does that actually count? And that's where you open a giant can of worms. There's about 1,000 different ways to classify progressive collapsing flat foot deformity, and that's only one of the types that you can try to go off of. So definitely a lot of vibes, definitely a lot of false positives. I will say that for this, there is a bit of an incentive for people. This is one of the last lines in the article that I'm honestly a little surprised that the amount of people who reported having flat feet was so high. It was like 76% actually did, because according to this, people are likely to check all the health-related boxes that may even be remotely associated with themselves to not have to do a full service. Do you think that we can make this assumption of trust? Because I would say 76% self-report accurate is pretty good. Do you think we could apply that in, say, America, for instance?
Be the exact opposite because all volunteer force, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, and also the self-report could vary as a function of current international or national conflicts.
Mm-hmm.
So if there's a lot of active conflict around the globe in the military you're being assessed for, the pressures to change your self-report could be very.
Sure.
It's also weird because like my mom's told me my whole life that my feet are flat, but like I've never had a doctor tell me. So I think it's also one of those things where like you don't necessarily know if you actually have it.
Yeah.
Because there's no like quantifiable metric that you probably had taken of your feet.
Well,
Somebody mentioned pain earlier, and as I got into the pain research space, I was very surprised at how often there's no detectable physical deformity when a person is experiencing chronic ongoing pain. Or there's a detectable physical deformity and no pain reported by the person. So there's also an asymptomatic. So whatever your criteria is for yes or no, this is present, there might also be symptomatic, asymptomatic, and you could change the assignment route based on, you know, if somebody has a flat foot and they're experiencing ongoing pain, their work assignment probably should be very different than, or a little different than the other categories.
yeah. There's a lot of, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Oh, so in these spaces, there are a lot of concerns about people who are originally asymptomatic veering into symptomatic when you put like a 50-something pound backpack and ask them to like run a marathon in it. So that's part of the consideration as well, for sure.
And I couldn't see it in the paper. Do all military conscripts, regardless of their eventual duty assignment, have to do the same basic training?
They did not mention that.
Yeah, because you could be losing valuable folks who could serve in a non-physically demanding capacity by requiring everybody to do the same physical training, which I'm guessing it's 100% go to basic training, and then you could injure everybody who's vulnerable.
I think that they, if somebody has the potential for injury, they just put them into the supplementary services, so the non-combat positions. So I think they account for that to some extent.
Okay.
Any other thoughts, comments, concerns, quips?
I think the BMI question is an interesting one. I'd love to hear if anyone has hypotheses about that.
So for those who just arrived, hi, Nicole. So this study was looking at people or flat foot and technically pes cavus with respect to BMI, at least in part. The authors assumed that the paper or that the results would show that individuals who had flat feet and flat feet only were going to have higher BMI, but it turns out that both pes cavus and pes planus had a high BMI. So any thoughts on why that might be the case?
Okay, this is totally out there, not based on science, but maybe having the anomaly of either high arches or flat feet causes some type of subjective discomfort with exercise. So they are less likely to exercise than someone with a normal foot.
Yeah, that's the general consensus. So great job. Any other thoughts?
Have one more thought, which is, so this is a prevalence study, which is important. Surveillance is important. But the other question is predictive validity. So if it's being used as a screening or selection criteria, you would not want to apply it in practice unless it predicted something important.
Yep.
So if it's predicting injury during basic training, then it's a valid, screening issue. But if it's not, then that would be it. That's a separate paper, separate question. So surveillance, but then in the issue of personnel selection and placement, physical abilities testing in general should be predictive of future success in work or injury. And if it's not, then you should eliminate it from your screening methods.
Yeah. The current definition is completely subjective and based off of symptomatic cases, again, that were so bad that they had to get screws implanted into their feet to get rid of the pain. So there's definitely work that needs to and is being done to try to get some answers on that.
Some of the more mild cases, would they be able to adjust the uniform and get like orthopedic, like arch support and do it?
Yes, they probably, I'm trying to remember if Korea does it, but historically there have been attempts to put people who are flat-footed into arches. America did this during World War I, and they thought, okay, this should be the cure-all. They even had like camps that they would train people so they could get arches by the end. Flat-foot ended up becoming the second leading cause of honorable discharge. The first was tuberculosis. So the actual practical use of orthotics in military context is a little debated. I'm sure it's beneficial to an extent, but we don't know where to draw that line.
So I know in like the US military, whenever you're leaving, you essentially do kind of just like a disability and injury inventory.
Yep.
So I'd be interested if the Korean military does something similar, because that could be an interesting study on these, especially these like borderline cases where they weren't excluded for flat foot, but they had like a mild case or something.
Yeah. That would actually be a good future work point, and I was going to mention that. So thank you for stealing my thunder.
You're welcome.
Anytime. Yeah, in the US, they do that, but you can only get it if you can prove that it occurred before, or it only occurred after you had joined. And I assume Korea probably does the same thing, but they should probably track that, so.
But I was thinking also just like if they're, I don't know this space and you clearly know it very well, but if there's other like you know, if back pain is associated with this or that, like that could be something that could be interesting.
That would be.
I've done lots of entry exams into the military. It's information, but on the physical form, there's actually a little container to check to see if they have flat feet or no.
Oh, nice.
But I've never rejected any applicants based on flat feet.
Gotcha.
Is
there a-
is the symptomatic F, not so much the presence.
Gotcha. Is that based off of, like, are you given a directive on how to handle that, or is it kind of based off of your judgment?
So usually what happens is that they go for a military evaluation screening and you fill out the form, and then is there flat feet or no? Is there whatever, what tattoos do they have? You just list all the things. And do they have any foot pain is the other question, right?
Mhm.
If they're flat foot, no pain, press on. And then the point about exit exams also is on there. It's not so much yes or no. That doesn't really matter if you have flat feet or not. It's like, are you symptomatic? What's the big concern?
All right. Well, that's good to know. I might have more questions for you later.
Anything else for Katrina? Going once, going twice, gone.
All right. Thank you, everyone.
They just have the acronym. That was.
It's just. Like they were like.
What's yours? Okay. I was gonna like take it back. Did I-
Analysis because it's a systematic.
Cool. So hi, everyone. My name is Katie Castro. I'm a PhD student in the Occupational Injury Prevention Program here. And the article I'm talking about today is called The Interplay Between Safety Climate and Emotional Exhaustion, the Effects on First Responders' Safety Behavior and Well-Being Over Time. Chose this article because I really like safety climate, and also some of the people on my committee wrote this article. So we can tear them apart if we want. Joe's not here, so you can really say whatever.
You can go now.
Yeah, exactly. So just a brief background. We all know that EMS, emergency medical service workers, first responders operate in high stress, high risk environments with both physical and psychological dangers. These demands can lead to safety incidences, near misses, injuries, burnout, depression, and even suicide. So not only the safety aspects, but also the mental health aspects. And this article really wants to understand how the organizational support via safety climate interacts with psychological strain, focusing on emotional exhaustion, and how that's a key to protecting workers and improving outcomes, both safety and organizational. So just some terms to know, because they'll be said a lot. Safety climate, which is the employee shared perceptions of an organization's safety policies, procedures, and practices. Safety compliance, I'm sure we all know what that is, form of safety behavior that refers to the degree in which members act in accordance with established protocols, processes, and standards. And then burnout. So we all know what burnout is, but this paper, instead of looking at the whole measure of depersonalization, personal achievement or accomplishment, I can't remember which one, and emotional exhaustion, this one just focuses on the emotional exhaustion piece. And they use the job demand resources model to kind of frame how they are looking at safety climate and emotional exhaustion. So they're looking at safety climate as an organizational resource and emotional exhaustion as a demand. And the job demand resources model suggests that the strain or stress is a response to an imbalance between the demands on the individual and the resources that they have to mitigate those demands. So they're thinking that safety climate can help mitigate the emotional exhaustion demands. And then this one is split up into a unit level and individual level, which will be important when we talk about the analysis because safety climate is measured at the group level and emotional exhaustion, safety compliance, morale, depression, all the variables of interest or outcomes of interest will be measured at the individual level. So the first hypothesis that this paper looks at is that emotional exhaustion moderates the positive relationship between station safety climate and individual safety compliance over time, such that the relationship will be weakened when emotional exhaustion is high. So they're looking at safety climate and how it relates to safety compliance, and they think that emotional exhaustion comes in and disrupts this relationship. And then they also are looking at the time aspect of this too. So this question is essentially asking if a fire station has a strong safety climate, do its responders still follow the safety rules if they're emotionally exhausted? So there's a few moving parts. The second hypothesis of interest is that safety climate moderates the negative relationship between emotional exhaustion and morale over time, such that the relationship will be weakened when the station's safety climate is high. So this one's looking at the predictor of emotional exhaustion on morale, and they think that safety climate could potentially offer a protective effect. So they're looking at how safety climate can interact with emotional exhaustion to hopefully improve morale. And then the third hypothesis is that safety climate moderates the positive relationship between emotional exhaustion and depression over time, such that the relationship will be weakened when the station's safety climate is high. So again, we're looking at emotional exhaustion as the predictor, depression as the outcome, and they're thinking that safety climate interacting with emotional exhaustion will improve depression levels, and not like to make more depression, but just like less depression. So here is the sample. It's a little confusing. So they sampled from 3 metro fire departments, and I included just some stats on what a metro, like how big, just so you can see how big a metro fire department is. Their average mean served population is over 1 million, and their annual calls are typically over 300,000, and this is just EMS. These were all from different regions of the United States, including the Northeast, Southwest, and West Coast. And then also all of these departments had on average like 80% EMS calls and 20% fire calls, meaning they run mostly medical calls. And so from these 3 metro departments, the authors worked with labor management teams from each of these departments, and that just means people from the union and then also like the fire chiefs to recruit 800 EMS first responders in these departments. So initially there were 800 enrolled, and then you can see based on each time point, because this was a longitudinal study, they measured the safety climate and emotional exhaustion. They measured everything at 3 time points via a survey. So they have 6 time points. And the first time, only 478 responded. Second time point dropped to 364. Third went down to 292. I don't know what happened in time 4, but it bumped back up to 444 and then dropped back down again at time 5 and time 6. So the final sample only has 208 EMS first responders nested within 45 stations. And so to keep the inclusion criteria for this, they needed at least 3 out of the 6 surveys completed to be a part of this study. And then to have a station included, they needed at least 3 respondents per station. So it's entirely possible that, you know, somebody completed all 6 surveys, but there was only 1 or 2 respondents from the station, so they just weren't included. A majority of the sample was male, and on average 36 to 37 years old, with on average 9 years of service, and predominantly white, non-Hispanic. I also include a bullet here because in these 208 responders, there was still 29% missing data. So almost 30% didn't complete all of the surveys, or maybe some of them did complete it and then some of them only got 3 done. But I thought the authors did a pretty good job of explaining what they did to kind of account for this. So they used PMM, which is predictive mean matching, and they used the responses from the data that was provided to kind of create responses to fill in those gaps. And PMM is typically used if you have 30% or less data missing, so they just made that cutoff. And so that's kind of the rationale they used to complete their data set. So the tool that was used was the Fire Service Organizational Culture of Safety Survey. And they captured safety climate from this. One other thing that was I thought really good that the authors did would include, they included all of the metrics that they use to calculate these variables. So these are all the questions on the survey that first responders answered to create the safety climate survey or safety climate measure. They also included emotional exhaustion from the MBI, safety compliance, which was newly developed, morale, and then also depression. They also had 2 control variables that they mentioned in their analysis, which was gender and tenure. And then the survey was collected from May to October of 2020. So that first wave of the COVID-19 pandemic. So the analysis that they did was multi-level modeling, and this is typically used when you have nested data. And here they have 4 levels of nested data. So the first one is time because they had 6 time points. The second level was individual because of those measures, including depression, emotional exhaustion, morale, and what was last? Oh, safety compliance. Those are all at the individual level. And then at the station and department level, they captured safety climate. So that's within groups and within a person, which is why they have multiple levels and why they chose multi-level modeling. This also helps when you look at change over time. And if you remember back to the hypotheses, which I'm sure you all do, they look at moderation across these different levels. So it's not within like individuals. They look at safety climate, which is like level 3, on individual factors, which are level 2. So that's what it seemed why they picked this one. And then it controls for the variance between and within groups. So some of the results, just a reminder, the question they were trying to ask for hypothesis 1 was, does emotional exhaustion affect the strength of the relationship between safety climate and safety compliance? There's a table that gives you all the values, but I like looking at these graphs better because the tables kind of overwhelm me sometimes. And what they found was that this hypothesis was supported. So on the x-axis, we have safety climate, y-axis, we have safety compliance, and then the different lines or the different slopes represent different levels of emotional exhaustion. So when you have high emotional exhaustion or 1 standard deviation more, that slope is weaker. And then when you have less emotional exhaustion, minus 1 standard deviation, you see that's the highest slope. So they did say that this was a statistically significant difference because the p-value was less than 0.01. And so they did confirm that safety or emotional exhaustion does moderate the relationship between safety climate and safety compliance in the expected way that they saw. Like when you have low exhaustion, safety compliance and safety climate are higher. The second hypothesis was asking, does safety climate reduce the negative impact of emotional exhaustion on morale over time? This one was not accepted. They did not find a statistical significance here. They did see, though, that the interaction between time and emotional exhaustion was significant, which makes sense because if you're emotionally exhausted, your morale is probably going to decrease over time, which is what they found. But that was not the original hypothesis. That was just kind of like a side finding. So overall, the second hypothesis was not accepted. And then the third hypothesis was looking at, does a strong safety climate reduce the impact of emotional exhaustion and depression over time? So they looked at a 3-way interaction here between time, safety climate, and emotional exhaustion and found that it was statistically significant. And so they broke this one out into 3 different graphs. The x-axis on these 3 graphs are time, and then y-axis is depression, and then each graph represents a different level of emotional exhaustion. And then the lines here represent the differences in safety climate. So the first graph we see with low emotional exhaustion over time, safety climate does help lower depression. And then it moderately helps, I guess, for the middle one because the slopes are decreasing a bit, but it's not that strong. And then what was interesting is that when you have high emotional exhaustion, it doesn't really seem to matter how your safety climate is because regardless of level of safety climate, it's increasing depression. So they called this one conditionally accepted because if you have low to moderate emotional exhaustion, safety climate can potentially help lower that depression. But if you have high emotional exhaustion, it doesn't really matter. So again, just the takeaways, because redundancy in systems, I truly believe in. They said that hypothesis 1 was supported, strong safety climate significantly associated with positive safety compliance, but this effect gets weaker if respondents are emotionally exhausted. Hypothesis 2 is not supported. Even stations with good safety climate, emotional exhaustion still lowered the morale. And then hypothesis 3 was conditionally supported. They saw a significant difference only when emotional exhaustion was low to moderate, but not when emotional exhaustion was high. So strengths and weaknesses, I thought it was a strength that this was longitudinal. They had 6 time points, although they had to account for missing data. I thought they explained what they did to account for the missing data pretty well. They used an established theory, which I know is not that weird in occupational health psychology literature, but typically the articles that we see here don't necessarily have that theory. So I thought it was cool that they explained it. They did really comprehensive analyses, some that I didn't even mention here, to kind of explain why they made the decisions along the way that they made. And then they addressed missing data. I thought they were practical findings. And then just my last bullet points about the paper, I thought it was pretty well written. I understood along the way why they were doing what they were doing. Weaknesses was definitely attrition. There was a lot of loss to follow up and people not answering everything. They started out with like 800 participants and then dropped down to 208. So there was a lot of loss to follow up there. It's all self-report data, which is influenced by, however someone's feeling at the time. The sample size is relatively small. They used brief measures for some of the key concepts. So like for morale and depression, they used abbreviated measures rather than the whole measure, which I know makes sense when you're trying to have a short survey with busy people. But if it's a main outcome, you might want to have the whole measure. Generalizability, these were for 3 metro fire departments, and a majority of the fire departments in the US are volunteer combination. So it's not really like these findings may not be replicable there. I include common method bias here with an asterisk because we know that it's not good to measure an outcome and an exposure or independent variable, dependent variable on the same tool, which they did. But ways to combat the bias there are to have repeated measures and to use different measures on the tool that have different scales, which they did. So I thought they did a decent job of trying to mitigate that in the best way that they could, given the research questions. And then one weakness, I didn't really understand why they limited it to 800 people when each of those departments probably have like 800 people on a single roster. So they could have opened up the pool to a lot more people. But my hypothesis or my guess is just that there was, maybe harder to follow up and get people to, I don't know, a smaller number is easier to track. Yeah, so any questions? And also my AI component was my my discussion questions, but we'll start with, does anyone have any questions for me first? Okay, we'll go to these questions then. So I just put into like ChatGPT, what are like graduate level questions for safety and health students based on this article. And the first one came up with, what additional job demands or resources might be relevant in EMS contexts?
Call volume.
Yeah, absolutely.
I saw data for Oregon fire departments and it varies so dramatically.
Totally.
By station.
Yep, absolutely. I think also, I mean, especially with emotional exhaustion, peer support, that is a huge thing that just isn't addressed here. And that definitely could have effects on things as well.
Well, I mean, if they've got the, I'm still not 100% clear on what they did with the model, but if they've got station mixed effects, as long as like call volumes that change much over time, that should be accounted for in there. But I'm not sure they did that because like they don't give me like an equation.
Well, their models don't explicitly visualize a work demand. So if it's in the model, it's not overtly in there what they're most interested in, but that's okay to not have it be your main interest.
Second question was, why is it important to study both safety behavior, and in this case, compliance, and mental health, in this case, morale and depression in occupational safety research? Yeah.
Even if someone's complying with something, like they're doing all the right things, if they do have pretty bad mental health, they may still like do shortcuts, or they might not pay all the attention they need to be paying. All the PPE in the world can't save you if you're just not like in the moment with like extremely dangerous situations.
Yeah, absolutely. And just anecdotally, like I work with some fire departments, and when we ask about like, you know, it's all about time. They have to make their call volume short so they can keep their ISO rating. So when they get somewhere faster, they don't wear their seatbelt or they don't put on their gear the right way, you know, but they get to the place faster. That's more important in the situation, but they're trying to like kind of shift the mental or like just the expectation of the department to be like be safe first, but then it's also that competing priority of like no, you have to be fast. So yeah, totally. Cool. Okay, question 3. The authors use self-report surveys for all the constructs. What are some alternative data sources or methods that could reduce common method bias in a study like this? My initial thought was they could maybe use injury data or near miss. I know some departments do near miss reporting. I know that's probably also hard to do because people don't always recognize that in the field, right? They just know that something bad didn't happen. Yeah, potentially those kinds of sources. Any other thoughts?
With this, with so many longitudinal measurements, I mean, this is really remarkable for it. So I found myself absorbed with the changes in criterion related validity for each follow-up time point, because I've never seen a study with so many longitudinal follow-ups of does safety climate relate to safety compliance and other important things.
Right.
So you would think that there was enough time, like maybe a couple of years, where there would be an experienced injury rate, even reportable injuries to test in the model. So I think that's a good point. Using different time points helps you a little bit with different or common methods bias, but you could also ask peers to rate peers or supervisors to rate workers on their safety compliance.
Totally.
So I think so-and-so is yes or no, high or low safety compliant. Yeah, good question though. I always love if we can drill down to actual more objective performance measures or what people are actually doing.
Right. Okay.
Safety audits.
Yeah, yeah. I was able to witness a safety audit because I did ride-alongs with one of the fire departments I worked with when I lived in Philly, and it was crazy how things changed so fast when they knew they were coming, right? Like they had to put on their uniforms really fast. Everyone, exactly. So yeah, I mean, I'm sure you can catch big issues that way, but like the more minor ones that could build up would be maybe a little tougher. But
so Zohar and Luria did a really interesting thing. They had research staff do site inspection safety audits, but they also did phone call, like ecological momentary samples of what the workers were experiencing. They focused on what was your most recent interaction with your supervisor like, but you could do the same thing. Give a phone call to a firefighter and say, describe safety in your most recent call.
yeah,
And they could give it some kind of, so then it's a little bit different. It's still self-report, but it's sampled in a different way.
definitely.
Brainstorm.
That's really interesting. Yeah.
It's kind of a side question. But I guess they did these at like monthly frequencies.
Correct.
Is what they were shooting for.
Yep.
Do you think that was the right frequency to choose? Do you think it should have been more frequent or less frequent?
Yeah, so I think so it's funny. So this team that worked on this, I was part of like a sister study, so I know why they did it this way. Which is unique. You don't normally know why. It's because they wanted to see how sensitive safety climate was in an environment where there's increasing like uncertainty, unknown things that could affect mental health. So they wanted to see how fast safety climate could change within that month. So the study that I worked on was working with 17 smaller fire departments to test that out. So I think that's why they chose it. I don't know if the frequency contributed to any feelings as well. You know what I mean? Like having the survey taken month after month after month, like I think I would dread it a little bit. I think maybe after, like, because we're not in a pandemic anymore, you could potentially go longer and maybe test this every quarter or maybe twice a year versus this often, especially with all the changes that happen in departments regularly. I think that's something too that could be really interesting to look at here is what other departmental changes happen during this time that could affect what's going on here. Don't know if I answered your question.
More or less, but the thing that I was kind of thinking about is we were mentioning like more objective measures, like say injury cases or something like that. And something I run into with the trucking research is like for any individual trucking company, a crash is rare unless they're really, really big.
Right.
And so like your choice of frequency in this context is kind of related to your choice of outcome variable. Because if you're doing a week or a month, you might not have enough injury cases to really say much of anything.
That's true. Yeah. Yeah, I think if they did it any closer together, no, there'd be
Yeah.
way too much loss to follow up for sure. But I like your point for sure. And I think on the focus survey, they do self-report injury as well. So they might have more than what the department has at that level. Because they're like, oh yeah, I stubbed my toe here, but like I'm not gonna report that. But it was an injury, so that's a good point. Yeah.
How reliable is the self-report data? Which I know is like always the question.
Yeah.
Something like a fire department, like are they gonna be incentivized to be like, oh no, yeah, we're really safe. Like I always wear my PPE, or are the surveys more anonymous where they can't actually?
Yeah, absolutely. So these are anonymous surveys, so they can be truthful and it doesn't get back to the department except at a report level. And the focus, the safety climate aspect of it has been validated working with the fire service. So it was built for the service or for the fire service with the fire service kind of thing. So it has been validated, so it should measure what it's trying to measure. But yeah, I think the frequency, having 6 points probably helps with that as well, because, you know, they're like, okay, we just need to get this survey done and out of the way. So they don't have time to be like, oh, I should probably be more, you know, the social bias of what should I be responding to on this survey? But that's a really good question. We have time. Okay. Next question. What do you make of the finding that safety climate was associated with increasing depression over time under high emotional exhaustion? So that was that hypothesis 3, where safety climate was kind of a protective effect or buffered emotional exhaustion and depression when it had low to moderate emotional exhaustion. But when you had high emotional exhaustion, that buffering effect wasn't there. What do you guys think about that?
Things you need to do to establish a good safety climate are another demand.
Totally. That's a good point.
I think, or that just job demands are, if they're too so overwhelming and causing emotional exhaustion, that safety, the relationship is just weakened. So you just imagine any person who's struggling with mental health or energy or emotional stuff, you know, you're going to kind of triage what you're doing on a day-to-day basis, and that extra effort for safety may just go. Even though you know leadership cares, safety is a high priority, you just don't have as much in your tank to put out the extra steps for safety.
Totally. Yeah, and or, you know, maybe at the organizational level, that doesn't help. Like maybe you need something more at the station level or something versus like, well, I guess here safety climate was at the station level, but maybe it's not safety climate that they need to mitigate that demand, kind of like you were saying. Maybe there's a different resource that could, I guess to complement what you're saying, there might be a different resource that could help that effect versus just safety climate. Because we don't know where the emotional exhaustion is coming from either. It might not be work related. This job is one that, you know, bleeds into your life pretty heavily. So yeah. And then the last question that I had for you guys was, this study was conducted during the pandemic. How might the findings differ in a non-crisis context or during a different type of organizational disruption? Yeah, I can go first. I think I think because this was like a prolonged period of stress, like we know that EMS responders, they know how to deal with emergencies, they know how to adapt and move quickly, but because this was so prolonged, I feel like the amount of just wear and tear on their mental health probably lasted longer, as it did for a lot of occupations and a lot of people in general. So I think maybe now, I don't know if the findings would be as intense, just because I don't know if maybe there's as much of that prolonged emergency state going on. And how I was thinking about it.
Since COVID was like a big period of like, you know, depression and emotional exhaustion and all that. I think that definitely contributed to seeing the depression and emotional exhaustion, even though like firefighting's like you, that's not great for your mental health in general, just with the amount of like stress you're under to like save lives, literally. But it might have just like they couldn't even go home to escape like the exhaustion, because like at that point it was just like everywhere,
Totally.
every facet of your life.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Anything else? All right, we'll call it.
Thank you, guys.